Disc jockey, drop the bass. Now the heads.
I had an interesting conversation yesterday on Twitter about why it is that I think egalitarianism is a better solution than individual campaigns, such as feminism, such as disabled rights, such as LGBT rights, and so on. It's because I take a universalist approach to human rights. That is, we should all be equal, we should all have the same rights, so much as this is possible. And that's my whole approach. Now, Twitter's not the best place to have these conversations to get into the nuances of it, so I wanted to kind of expand on the point that I'm trying to make in the hopes that it will help people understand. Now, there's little doubt that in situations where particular groups' rights are massively curtailed, that there is benefit for a time for having movements that focus on those particular rights. So, back in the past, there was definitely good reason to have women's rights groups and organisations fighting for that equality. Today, not so much, I don't think. And indeed, in the West, it's arguable that the situation has reversed, that men are now in dire need because their needs and so on haven't been addressed. And this is a relevant point, as we'll get to. So when things are really egregious, there is a good side to having these individual movements fighting for particular groups' rights. But I take a much broader, longer-term view of the issue. Now, none of these things exist in isolation from one another. And that's kind of the angle that I'm coming at it from. That's where I'm coming from when I talk about egalitarianism. Don't mistake this for intersectionality, which seems to really be a bun fight over, who is the least privileged and who deserves the most help. No, rather I'm talking about taking an holistic approach, understanding that one set of people's problems exists within a system, and so that if you address a particular issue, that's going to have a knock-on into other areas that you need to consider. And this is why, even though feminism, LGBT rights and so on has done great things in our history, that I no longer think they're particularly needed individually, when we should just take an egalitarian view and look into other nations which haven't had these same revolutions in rights for whatever group we're talking about, why I would still advocate an egalitarian, holistic approach in those instances, hoping to avoid some of the problems that we've developed here in the West by this previous approach. It's fairly hard to explain, so I'll try using an example. Okay, let's take men and women's rights. There are areas in which women are and have been elevated, there are areas in which men are and have been elevated, there are areas in which women are and have been deprecated, and the same is true of men. Now, feminism has primarily addressed the arenas in which women have disadvantage. It has not tried to remove the areas in which women have advantage. It has tried to remove the areas in which men have had advantage, but not to address the areas in which men have had disadvantage. And feminism has been very successful. So we can arguably say that we're now at a state where women retain their advantages and are otherwise equal to men. Men have had their advantages removed, but have not had their disadvantages removed, creating a new imbalance. With an egalitarian approach, we could see how men's rights and issues and women's rights and issues interact with one another. So things like rightfully extending rights to work in all kinds of different arenas, enter education, vote and so on, have elevated women, but at the same time they have to an extent undermined old views of masculinity, and quite rightly. But at the same time we have not addressed this lack and this shift in men, and men's rights have not been extended and expanded to be equal to women's where they were previously below. So in addressing one inequity and failing to see how it interacts with the rest of the world, we've created new inequities, and we've created problems that didn't exist before, and we have created a massive amount of resentment and problems in another community while addressing the ones in another. And if we'd taken a more holistic approach, we could say that, okay, if we extend the right to work and so on to women, as we should, then we're obviously going to have to address certain aspects of male identity, which has been historically and still very much is related to the provider role and so on. But that role has been undermined, the opportunities for that have been undermined. So you need to address that, you need to find new ways to express useful, productive masculinity outside the world of work and so on. So by taking that holistic view, by saying, okay, everyone has the right to this, everyone needs to be equal, everyone needs to feel valued and useful, you help to avoid those kind of issues. Let's take another issue of, say, race. Okay, so if we say that we look at the black community and we see a great deal of poverty and drug use and crime and so on, that can appear to be a problem with the black community. If we take a more holistic approach, we can start to see that this is really majoritively rooted in poverty. If we come into this kind of community and we start throwing money around specifically at blacks, you create further divisions, you create more reasons for whites and blacks both at the same poverty level to hate each other, because the whites are going to see that these people are getting more help. If you take a more egalitarian and interlaced view, you can see that it's poverty, and you can see how boosting up one particular community on an arbitrary characteristic like race is going to cause further resentment, problems, possibly more violence, increase in racism and so on. So by taking that holistic approach and saying, well, everyone deserves a decent quality of life, we see that there's a particular problem in this particular ethnic community, but it doesn't just exist there, it exists everywhere. So if we apply our benefits and we invest socially in everyone who is poor, it will naturally provide more aid to that group, but without further marginalising them and making other groups resentful, jealous and hateful. So when I talk about egalitarianism, I mean everybody should be treated equally, everybody should be treated with respect, and that we need to approach these issues holistically so that we avoid these kind of problems developing in the future and creating new inequities. So if we were going to create a gender revolution in Islamic nations and so on, you can't address women in isolation. You need to understand how the society interlocks, how the responsibilities and so on interlock. You need to see how gender inequality there also affects men, albeit in different ways. And by addressing the whole and understanding how it fits together, you can create a far more effective move towards equality without leaving anyone behind or creating new problems. Yeah, hopefully those examples and that kind of explains myself better. Feel free to disagree, of course. You're allowed to be wrong. But yeah, I hope that explains to everyone. Later. If you like what I do here, please like, subscribe. You can find me on social media, on Twitter at Grimachu, James Desborough on Facebook, James Grim Desborough on G+. My main website is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. If you want to help me out with a little money, which will go to support my games, writing and other projects, you can do so at Patreon, which is also Grimachu.